The summer of 1985 in Beaumont was sultry, the kind of heat that clung to the back of your neck and made the air shimmer over asphalt. College students lounged on benches under sprawling oak trees at Lamar University, their laughter mingling with the distant hum of traffic. Among them was Jessica Monroe, 21, a journalism student with a notebook always in hand, a stack of books under one arm, and a perpetual smile that drew people in. She worked part-time at the Magnolia bookstore downtown, where she recommended novels to strangers with enthusiasm and charm. Friends described her as kind, ambitious, and relentlessly curious. She had a way of asking questions that made people think, that made people reveal themselves. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. On this particular Wednesday morning, Jessica had stayed up late typing an assignment about local politics for her journalism class. By 6:30 a.m., she was already awake, wearing sneakers and a worn denim jacket, walking along the Neches River trail before heading to the bookstore. Her routine was familiar to the few who shared the path at that hour: joggers, dog walkers, and a handful of early risers. Nobody, not even the river itself, hinted at the darkness that would soon shatter her life. Meanwhile, at Beaumont Police Department, rookie Detective Elena Vargas, 26 years old, arrived for her first summer assignment in the Homicide Division. She had graduated from the police academy just 2 years prior and had already earned a reputation for meticulous note-taking and an almost preternatural ability to connect seemingly unrelated details. Her mentor, Lieutenant Robert Callahan, a seasoned detective with graying hair and an ever-present cigarette behind his ear, met her in the squad room. "Elena, you're going to be assigned a tough one today," he said, handing her a sheet of information. "Beaumont PD got a call around 7 a.m., body found along the Neches River trail. Female, early 20s, looks not good." Elena's stomach tightened, a mix of anticipation and dread. "I'm ready, sir. Let's get it right." Callahan gave a slight nod. "Good. Just remember, feelings don't solve cases. Evidence does. And always keep your instincts sharp. You'll need them." By 7:15 a.m., Elena drove her small cruiser along the humid streets of Beaumont, past the mid-century brick homes and overpasses lined with tall pines, toward the park where the body had been found. When she arrived, yellow tape fluttered in the wind, cordoning off a narrow trail beside the riverbank. Officers were guiding a handful of early morning joggers away from the scene. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. The body of Jessica Monroe lay crumpled against the roots of a willow tree, her face pale and serene, in a way that made Elena's stomach churn. It was a scene of shocking stillness, the chaos of her final moments hidden beneath the deceptive calm of the morning. Her notebook lay a few feet away, damp and open to a blank page. Elena knelt beside her carefully, taking in the small details: the scuff on her sneaker, the broken bracelet on her wrist, the faint smudges of soil on her jacket. Officers had already begun photographing the scene, collecting evidence. It was a methodical process, but Elena could see how each piece of debris might tell a story. Her hands hovered above the body, hesitant but determined. This was her first real homicide, her first chance to test the instincts she'd honed at the academy. As she observed, a young man approached the tape. He was tall, with dark hair and a clean-cut appearance, wearing a faded red baseball cap. His gait was unhurried but purposeful. He flashed a concerned expression and showed his Beaumont College ID. "I'm Daniel Whitaker," he said smoothly. "I live nearby. I jog past here often. Can I do anything to help?" Elena noted his calmness, the easy confidence in his voice. Something about it unsettled her, though she couldn't place it yet. For now, he seemed helpful, concerned, maybe even heroic. "We're handling it," Elena replied, her tone polite but firm. "Please, stay behind the tape." Whitaker smiled faintly and nodded, watching the officer's work. Elena returned to the body, examining the scene more closely. The river ran quietly beside them, and a few early sunlight rays filtered through the morning mist, glinting off the water. The park was eerily quiet now, save for the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the distant bark of a dog. Back at the station, Elena began interviews. She started with Jessica's roommate, Clara Jenkins, who described Jessica as ambitious and responsible, the kind of student who balanced classes, work, and social life effortlessly. Clara mentioned that Jessica had been texting someone obsessively the week prior, but didn't recognize the number. Next was Evelyn Monroe, Jessica's mother, who was trembling and clutching a handkerchief. Her grief was raw and immediate. "She's so careful, she wouldn't just disappear," Evelyn said, voice quivering. "Something's happened, something terrible." Her father, Harold Monroe, tried to maintain composure. Initially skeptical of police procedures, he now looked to Elena with hope. "Detective, we need answers," he said, voice firm but cracked. "Please, whoever did this, make them pay." Elena also interviewed Jessica's co-workers at the Magnolia bookstore. They painted a picture of a meticulous, cheerful young woman, popular with customers and colleagues alike. No enemies, no recent conflicts, nothing that suggested motive. But a pattern began to emerge. Jessica had several interactions with Daniel Whitaker during her walks and at the bookstore. He had been a customer and seemed unusually interested in her routine. Forensics began compiling preliminary evidence: fingerprints from Jessica's notebook, fibers from her denim jacket, traces of soil and hair, and, most importantly, skin cells under her fingernails. The latter suggested a struggle. Elena felt a sinking realization. The perpetrator had been close enough for her to try to defend herself, but skilled or strong enough to overpower her. She returned to the crime scene late that afternoon. The early heat had intensified, and the smell of damp earth had grown stronger. Elena crouched by the broken bracelet again, mentally reconstructing the sequence of events. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle that refused to fit. She replayed witness statements in her mind, noting inconsistencies and gaps. Her frustration was mounting. 1985 forensics was limited. DNA technology as she knew it from textbooks wouldn't be practical for decades. All she had were fingerprints, fibers, and witness recollections. She filed her initial report and went home late, sleep eluding her. Dreams of Jessica's smile haunted her, cut short in a way that felt unfair, unnatural. Over the next week, Elena followed every lead, every tip, every observation from friends and co-workers. Nothing added up. Daniel Whitaker remained a figure hovering in the background. Always polite, always concerned, yet always near enough to monitor progress. His interest in the case was unnerving, but there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. Elena met with Lieutenant Callahan over lunch in a quiet diner downtown. "Any progress?" he asked, stirring his coffee absently. Elena sighed, frustration etched on her young face. "Dead ends everywhere. The fibers match nothing in our database. No fingerprints on site beyond hers. Witnesses are helpful but don't remember much. And there's this guy, Whitaker. He's always at the edges of the investigation. He's off, but we can't prove anything." Callahan leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed. "I've seen that before. Good intentions can mask darker motives. Keep an eye on him, but don't let it cloud your judgment." Elena nodded, but her mind was already spinning with possibilities. She drove home, the Beaumont streets quieting under the evening glow, and reviewed her notes once more. Every interaction, every trace of evidence, every witness statement, she was determined not to let anything slip. The Monroe family's grief weighed heavily on her conscience. She couldn't fail them. Days turned into weeks, and the trail began to grow colder. Leads fizzled, potential suspects were cleared. Elena began to realize the cruel reality of her job. Sometimes, despite your best efforts, the perpetrator remained a step ahead. She had the weight of a city's expectation and the victim's family's suffering pressing down on her young shoulders. And yet, something told her this case would not remain cold forever. There was a pattern in the chaos, a presence lingering at every corner, subtle yet unmistakable. Someone was watching. Someone had orchestrated the crime meticulously. Someone who understood the limitations of law enforcement and the vulnerabilities of human behavior. She closed her case file late one night, the humming ceiling fan above her small apartment, the only sound breaking the silence. Her gaze lingered on a photograph of Jessica Monroe pinned to her corkboard, blonde hair catching the sunlight, a bright smile, eyes full of life and curiosity. Elena whispered to herself, a vow that would carry her through decades of challenges. "I will find who did this," she said softly, "no matter how long it takes." Outside, Beaumont slept under a humid, starlit sky, but in one quiet corner of the city, evil had slipped away, unpunished, leaving a young detective obsessed and a community shrouded in grief. And somewhere, Daniel Whitaker watched, calculating, waiting, his presence unnoticed, his obsession just beginning. The pieces were on the board, the game had begun, and Elena Vargas had no idea that this would be a pursuit that would span decades, through the growth of a killer hidden in plain sight, advances in forensic science, and the persistence of a detective who refused to let time erase the truth. The summer of 1986 in Beaumont was suffocating, hot, and relentless. Detective Elena Vargas had just turned 27, a year removed from the first chaotic days of Jessica Monroe's murder investigation. The humidity seemed to cling to her skin like the weight of the unresolved case. She had grown taller in confidence, but not in patience. Every morning she awoke with a fresh ache in her chest, an invisible knot of worry, always returning to the same haunting question. Who did this to Jessica? She had been promoted to detective second class earlier that year, a milestone she had celebrated quietly at home, with a small dinner with her parents. Lieutenant Robert Callahan, now nearing retirement himself, had commended her work. "Vargas," he said, as they reviewed the files in his cramped office, "you've got instincts most rookies dream of. But instincts alone won't solve a case like this. Remember, facts over feelings. Always." Elena knew he was right. Facts mattered, but feelings, her gut, the moments that didn't fit the narrative, were what kept her awake at night. Facts could only take her so far. It was the intangible sense of a life violently stolen that drove her deeper into obsession. Her small apartment on College Street was filled with boxes of files, photographs, and scribbled notes. Among them, the Jessica Monroe file was never far from her side. Elena had memorized every detail, the time of death, the fibers, the location of skin cells beneath Jessica's fingernails, even the faint footprints that had led to the riverbank. She kept a personal copy, annotated, highlighted, underlined in red. It was both a comfort and a curse. Daniel Whitaker, now Daniel Cross, remained a ghost in her thoughts. He had quietly disappeared from the public eye after parting ways with the initial investigation, only to resurface 2 years later in 1988 as a young, ambitious officer joining Beaumont PD. His transformation was seamless, clean-cut, polite, helpful. Elena had noticed him in the department when she had visited for administrative paperwork. "He's a solid addition," Callahan had noted. "Keeps to himself, follows orders, dependable." But Elena remembered the subtle twitch in his eyes at the riverbank that August morning, the way he had lingered just long enough to seem concerned, yet never fully revealed himself to investigators. He had been watching, studying, measuring reactions. That memory haunted her. He's too convenient, too perfect. Through the 1990s, Daniel, now Cross, moved quietly up the ranks. By 1995, he was in evidence management, handling everything from burglaries to homicides, including cold cases like Jessica's. Elena knew this was no coincidence. She had often felt, with a chill, that he monitored the file personally, ensuring no loose ends ever tied back to him. Meanwhile, Elena's own career progressed. She was promoted to detective first class in 1992, taking on more complex cases, learning the politics of the department, and navigating a culture that often rewarded results over persistence. Yet, despite these successes, the Monroe case remained her obsession, quietly eroding other areas of her life. Her personal life had suffered. Relationships faltered, friends drifted away. A serious romance with a fellow detective in 1989 ended when he confessed he could not compete with a file on a dead girl. Her health began to show cracks as well. Frequent migraines, long nights without sleep, an unshakable fatigue that medication barely alleviated. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The Monroe family aged alongside her obsession. Evelyn Monroe, Jessica's mother, had grown quieter, her once vibrant personality dimmed by grief. Harold, Jessica's father, alternated between skepticism and trust, often calling Elena late at night, his voice shaking as he asked if there was any progress. Rachel, Jessica's younger sister, had been only 16 at the time of the murder. By the early 2000s, she had become a young adult deeply invested in the pursuit of justice, often accompanying her mother to the department, observing the work with wide eyes. Detective Vargas, Rachel had said once in 2001, "You have to find him. Jessica deserves that." The frustration was mutual. Dead ends abounded. False leads plagued the investigation. Vincent Harlow, a transient seen near the river that August, had been questioned multiple times. His alibi always checked out. Martin DeLuca, a local man with a criminal record, was briefly a suspect after one coworker misremembered seeing him near the bookstore. But every thread unraveled, leaving Elena with nothing but a gnawing emptiness and a stack of rejected evidence. Meanwhile, Daniel Cross maintained his carefully curated double life. He attended department social events, often seen quietly observing the detective team. He would volunteer to help with minor cold cases, inserting himself in ways no one could suspect. Elena, deep in the files, had no idea he had full access to the original crime scene evidence, meticulously catalogued, preserved. He could have destroyed it at any time, yet he didn't. Something inside him, pride, guilt, obsession, prevented him from doing so. By 2005, Elena had taken over the cold case unit in Beaumont PD, determined to keep Jessica's file alive. Her dedication inspired younger detectives, though she had to be careful. Some whispered that she let her emotions cloud judgment. They don't understand, she thought. They weren't there. They didn't see the girl lying by the river with the morning mist clinging to her hair, hands scraped, eyes lifeless, like a warning that the world could be cruel and senseless. Each year brought incremental progress, fiber tests revisited, fingerprints cross-checked against new databases, interviews conducted with old witnesses who had relocated, aged, or moved on. But the killer remained elusive. Daniel's fingerprints were never on record. His face, though familiar in 1985 to those at the riverbank, now obscured by the passage of time, drew no suspicion. Through the late 2000s, Elena's life outside the department grew sparse. She had sold her small apartment and moved closer to Beaumont PD for convenience. Evenings were spent poring over files, reading through old notebooks, cross-referencing reports, and marking up new findings. She rarely took vacations, claiming her own health as a minor inconvenience compared to justice for Jessica. Her friends had largely given up. Her parents deceased, leaving her only the cold hum of the office lights and the quiet whispers of a case that refused to die. Despite the dead ends and political pressure, Elena found moments that reminded her why she couldn't give up. Sometimes Evelyn Monroe stopped by the precinct with coffee, not to demand updates, but to show gratitude. "Jessica mattered," she would say softly. "Thank you for remembering her." Those visits anchored Elena more than she ever admitted. Even when the department grew restless with her fixation and colleagues whispered behind her back, the look in Evelyn's eyes strengthened her resolve. She wasn't just solving a case, she was fighting for a mother who refused to abandon her daughter in death. By 2010, the department had introduced digital archiving. Elena ensured Jessica's case file was digitized, allowing her to cross-reference decades of evidence with modern databases. It was then that she first noticed patterns that hadn't been apparent before. Minor anomalies in witness statements, discrepancies in patrol logs, and subtle gaps in evidence handling from the late 1980s and early 1990s, the period when Daniel Cross had transitioned into evidence management. She couldn't prove anything, not yet. But the pieces were starting to form a picture, one she would eventually hand to a younger detective who would carry the case into the age of modern forensics. The years took their toll. By the time Elena retired in 2015 at age 56, her hair streaked with gray, hands lined with decades of investigative toil, she was no closer to finding the killer. She left Beaumont PD with a quiet resignation, but not defeat. The case remained unsolved, and the man responsible had evaded justice entirely, hiding in plain sight, His career progressing within the same system meant to catch him. Yet, even as she walked out of the department doors for the last time, the obsession remained, like a shadow she could never shake. She had devoted 30 years to a single murder, but her dedication had not waned. It had evolved into a careful, patient watchfulness. She knew, instinctively, that the truth had a way of surfacing eventually, and when it did, she would be ready. The summer of 2020 in Beaumont was unusually humid, even for August. Detective Elena Vargas, now 61, sat in her modest home office, the ceiling fan rattling overhead as she leafed through the worn files she had kept from Jessica Monroe's 1985 murder. The case had never left her. Even in retirement, she could recall every face, every step of the investigation, every red herring, and every dead end. It had been 35 years since that morning jog along the Neches River revealed Jessica's lifeless body, and yet the grief of her family, the frustration of unanswered questions, still echoed in Elena's memory. She had been sipping black coffee when the phone rang. The caller ID read Beaumont Police Department, Cold Case Unit. Elena hadn't expected to be contacted again, but she had a feeling she knew what it was about. "Detective Vargas?" said the voice on the line. It was crisp, professional, and carried a faint trace of excitement. "This is Detective Naomi Chen. I'm heading the Cold Case Unit. We're reopening the Jessica Monroe investigation. We'd like your insight." Elena felt a familiar tension in her chest, a mixture of dread, hope, and responsibility. "Ms. Chen, Naomi, right?" she said. "I retired 5 years ago. Are you sure you need me?" "Yes," Chen replied. "Your work on this case is legendary. I've read everything, the notes, the interviews, the evidence logs. You kept the fire alive when everyone else moved on. We could use your perspective. The technology now can finally give us answers." Elena exhaled, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. "All right," she said finally. "I'll help." Naomi Chen was 28, with a lean build, dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail, and a notebook that seemed glued to her hand. Elena met her at the Beaumont PD Cold Case Division office, a modernized wing with sleek desks, computers with forensic analysis software, and a small evidence vault. The contrast to 1985's paper-strewn, typewriter-driven world could not have been starker. "You'll want to see this first," Naomi said, pulling out a small, sealed evidence bag. Inside were remnants of Jessica's struggle. A few fibers, a broken bracelet, and most importantly, the microscopic skin cells collected under her fingernails. The last piece of evidence that had been too minute for analysis in 1985. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the bag. Decades of waiting, decades of what-ifs, had brought her to this exact moment. She thought of Evelyn Monroe, Jessica's mother, who had aged gracefully but carried a sorrow that never left her. Harold, Jessica's father, whose initial skepticism had given way to quiet trust in Elena, and Rachel, Jessica's younger sister now in her 50s, who had spent a lifetime without answers. She knew they would be watching, waiting for news. "Do you think DNA testing can finally tell us something?" Elena asked. Naomi smiled faintly, a mixture of reassurance and excitement. "It already has in similar cold cases. We're sending these cells to a lab with a specialized protocol. It's meticulous, but if the sample is viable, it can give us a match to anyone in the national database, even someone who's never been a suspect before." Elena nodded, feeling the weight of the decades press on her. She had known all along that someone had manipulated this investigation, had watched from the shadows, and had evaded justice. But now, there was finally hope. Weeks passed. Elena and Naomi pored over every detail from the original case, the initial interviews with friends, the co-workers at the bookstore, and every neighbor who had seen Jessica in her final days. They reviewed old photographs, crime scene sketches, and reports meticulously typed on yellowing paper. Every so often, Elena would sigh heavily, remembering moments she had once dismissed, tiny clues, seemingly meaningless interactions that might have hinted at Daniel Whitaker's obsession. Then came the call that would reignite decades of hope. "Detective Vargas?" Naomi's voice was barely contained. "We have a hit. The DNA under Jessica Monroe's fingernails. It matches Daniel Cross. That's Daniel Whitaker." Elena's heart stopped for a moment. She sank into the chair, gripping the edge of the desk. Daniel Whitaker, the man who had appeared helpful at the crime scene, who had inserted himself subtly into the investigation, who had avoided suspicion for decades while hiding in plain sight, was alive, traceable, and finally linked to Jessica Monroe. "Cross?" Elena asked quietly. "He changed his name?" "Yes," Naomi replied. "Records show he legally changed it in 1987, 2 years after Jessica's murder. He joined the Beaumont Police Department in 1988, worked patrol, then evidence management, had access to every piece of physical evidence, including this case." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the familiar mix of rage and incredulity. All these years he had been right there, pretending to be part of the solution while making sure nothing incriminated him. And yet, somehow, he had preserved the evidence. It was as if part of him had wanted to be caught, had left a trail for the right person to follow. Naomi and Elena began the painstaking process of tracing Daniel Cross's career. They dug through decades of personnel files, payroll records, and performance evaluations. Every promotion, every commendation, every routine assignment was cataloged. He had kept a low profile, known to colleagues as quiet, diligent, unremarkable, exactly what a predator hiding in plain sight would want. They found gaps in his history, periods when he withdrew savings, moved residences, or took extended leaves. Financial records indicated that in 2010 he liquidated nearly all of his assets and disappeared from conventional life, leaving no traceable bank accounts, no credit cards, and no phone lines. Elena felt a familiar frustration creeping in. She had once been powerless to catch him, and now, decades later, he was still elusive. "He's methodical," she said, rubbing her temples. "Every move calculated. He knew we'd eventually catch up, but he thought he could outlast us." Naomi looked over the digital map she had compiled of Cross's potential hideouts. Most of his family property is in the rural outskirts of Jefferson County, near Beaumont's northern edges. Small ranches, remote roads. If he's hiding anywhere, it's there. Elena nodded, a sense of grim determination settling in. She felt again that same fire she had felt as a young detective. A mix of obsession, responsibility, and personal stake. She thought of Jessica Monroe and how her murder had shaped Elena's career, her life, and her relationships. The thought that justice might finally be within reach made her feel both energized and exhausted at once. Meanwhile, in a quiet, sun-scorched home outside Beaumont, Daniel Cross sat alone, unaware that the DNA results had sealed his fate. He pored over old photographs of himself, young and energetic, juxtaposed against images of Jessica Monroe, vivid in his memory despite the decades. The meticulous notes he had kept on the Monroe investigation were spread across a small desk, marked with observations and minor inconsistencies from the early days. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, now held a flicker of fear. "I knew it would come back to me," he muttered. "I just didn't think, not this fast." He realized that every move he had made, every careful step to infiltrate the police department, every layer of deception, was unraveling. And for the first time in 50 years, the predator felt truly hunted. Back at the Beaumont PD cold case unit, Elena and Naomi coordinated with the tech team, mapping potential routes Cross could take if he tried to flee. Surveillance footage from local businesses was re-examined. They cross-referenced addresses, vehicle registrations, and utility records. Every detail was scrutinized for patterns. Naomi looked up from the computer, eyes wide with excitement. "We're close, Elena. If he's in one of those rural areas, we can plan a tactical approach without giving him a chance to run." Elena nodded slowly, remembering her younger self, full of energy and optimism, chasing leads along the Neches River in 1985. She now carried the weight of decades, but the fire inside her had not dimmed. "Then we plan carefully," she said. "This ends the way it should. We can't let him slip away again." For the next few months, they meticulously built the case against Daniel Cross. They compiled every report, every interview, and all historical forensic evidence into a cohesive, comprehensive narrative. The Monroe family was kept informed. Rachel Monroe, now in her 50s, was involved in providing insight and support. Evelyn and Harold, though older, were able to follow the developments, gaining hope that their daughter's murderer would finally be held accountable. By early 2023, all the pieces had aligned. The DNA match was irrefutable. Historical records painted a clear picture of a man who had inserted himself into law enforcement to cover his crime. The remote property on the northern outskirts of Beaumont had been identified as the most likely location where he had been hiding, and law enforcement strategists were assembling the team for the final operation. Elena stood at the edge of the Neches River one humid afternoon, staring at the water where she had first discovered Jessica's body decades ago. She traced her finger across the bark of a nearby tree, recalling every detail she had observed as a young detective. "This ends soon, Jessica," she whispered. "I promise you, it ends soon." Naomi placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And this time, we won't let him out of our sight. You've waited decades, Elena. Justice is finally coming." Elena felt a swell of emotion. Anticipation, anger, and relief all intermingled. She knew the next steps would be dangerous. Daniel Cross was unpredictable, cunning, and desperate. But for the first time in 50 years, the sense of helplessness that had haunted her every day was replaced by a resolute purpose. The team finalized the tactical plan: surveillance, approach, and coordinated apprehension. Every detail had been rehearsed, every contingency considered. They knew Cross would not surrender easily. Elena's decades of intuition, combined with Naomi's technological insight, gave them the advantage. As they prepared to depart, Elena glanced at the framed photograph of Jessica Monroe she had kept on her office wall all these years. Her eyes were filled with youthful hope and promise, forever frozen at 21. Elena whispered, "Soon you'll have your justice. I swear it." The sun dipped low over Beaumont, casting long shadows across the city. The calm before the storm stretched out, tense and electrifying. Across the rural outskirts, a figure moved cautiously, unaware that the net was closing. In 2023, after nearly 4 decades of frustration, fear, and longing, the chase was about to reach its climax. Elena and Naomi, together across generations, were ready to confront the man who had evaded justice for 50 years, and finally bring him to account. The sun had just begun its descent over Beaumont's northern outskirts, casting long shadows across the rolling fields and wooded areas that stretched toward the horizon. Detective Elena Vargas, flanked by Detective Naomi Chen and a small tactical team, sat quietly in an unmarked SUV. The rural property they had identified as Daniel Cross's hideout loomed ahead, a cluster of aging structures surrounded by a high fence, overgrown weeds, and a sense of abandonment. Every detail had been mapped, every exit route planned, and yet the tension was suffocating. Elena's hands rested on her knees, but they trembled slightly. She thought of Jessica Monroe, 21, when her life was stolen. She thought of the decades she had spent trying to bring justice, of the dead ends, the false leads, the nights spent poring over old files. And now, after almost 40 years, the culmination of her life's work rested on the next few hours. Naomi leaned forward, her dark eyes scanning the property through binoculars. "We have eyes on him," she whispered. "He's in the main house. Seems unaware we're here." Elena nodded, taking a deep breath. She remembered Daniel Cross as he had been decades ago, charming, polite, outwardly helpful. How easy it had been for everyone to overlook him, to trust him. He had manipulated the original investigation from within, hiding behind the uniform of law while destroying the life of a young woman. The thought of the decades he had stolen weighed heavily on her. Lieutenant Robert Callahan's words echoed in her mind. "Remember, Elena, the law may be patient, but you cannot let emotions compromise your focus." She exhaled slowly and rose from the seat, joining the tactical briefing. The team would approach from multiple angles. Elena and Naomi would oversee, ensuring precision and safety. Their priority was to apprehend Cross without casualties, but she knew that unpredictability had always been part of his nature. The SUV rolled quietly over the gravel driveway, stopping a few hundred feet from the house. The team dismounted, moving in silence. Elena's pulse raced as they spread out, officers taking positions behind trees, vehicles, and fences. Cross had no idea they were there, and that was their advantage. "On my signal," Naomi whispered, "we go in. Don't let him slip. He's clever, but he's human." Elena's eyes narrowed. She could feel the culmination of decades pressing down on her, yet she reminded herself. Patience, observation, control. One wrong move could allow him to escape, and after 40 years, she would not forgive herself. The team advanced, stepping lightly through the overgrown yard. The main house, a weathered wooden structure, was eerily silent. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon sun streaming through broken windows. Elena's instincts screamed that danger was imminent. Suddenly, movement near the back door caught her attention. Cross had noticed them. He was older now, gray-streaked hair, thin, but his eyes still carried the same calculating sharpness. For a moment he froze, scanning the surroundings, and then turned and ran toward the dense trees at the edge of the property. "Move!" Elena barked, and the team surged forward. Officers yelled commands, their boots crunching against the gravel and undergrowth. Cross sprinted, surprisingly agile, ducking between trees and leaping over fallen logs. Elena ran alongside, her lungs burning, adrenaline surging. Naomi was close behind, radioing positions to officers fanning out around the perimeter. They had predicted attempts to escape. This was not unexpected. Cross darted into a clearing, then vanished momentarily behind an abandoned barn. Elena slowed, scanning for movement. She could hear heavy breathing. Branches snapping, the faint metallic clank of Cross's steps against debris. And then, suddenly, he emerged on the far side, realizing escape was narrowing. "Stop! Police!" Elena shouted, her voice cutting through the humid air. Cross hesitated, then bolted again, moving toward a steep embankment leading to a small creek. Elena and Naomi exchanged glances. They had him cornered. Elena sprinted, careful not to lose sight, feeling the years of frustration and obsession boiling inside her. Finally, he tripped over a tree root, tumbling to the ground. Elena and Naomi reached him simultaneously, weapons drawn. Cross raised his hand slowly, the smirk he had worn in his younger days replaced with a flicker of panic. "You don't have to do this, Daniel," Elena said firmly, using his real name to strike at the truth he had buried for decades. "It's over. You're not getting away." He looked up at her, eyes wild. "You don't understand. You can't understand. I've survived this long because I'm careful. I did what I had to do." "You killed Jessica Monroe," Elena said, voice steady but laced with anger. "You destroyed a family and you hid behind a badge to do it. It's over now." Cross hesitated, then slumped into the grass, defeated. Officers moved in, handcuffing him as he muttered incoherently. Elena watched him carefully, recognizing the fragile mix of cunning and fear in his posture. At the Beaumont PD, Cross was booked and held an interrogation. Elena and Naomi prepared for questioning, aware that this would be more than procedural. It was the emotional climax of decades of pursuit. Cross refused to speak at first, sitting silently in the sterile room, hands cuffed to the table. His eyes flicked between Elena and Naomi, wary, defensive. Elena leaned forward, speaking softly but with authority. "Daniel, it's time to tell the truth. You know why you're here. Jessica Monroe's murder, it was you. You manipulated the investigation for decades, we know. You can stop lying now." For a long moment he said nothing, then finally whispered, voice hoarse, I didn't think anyone would ever find me. I thought I was clever. I thought I could hide forever." "You weren't clever enough," Elena replied, her voice unwavering. "You underestimated the truth, and you underestimated persistence. You've been caught. Now you will face the consequences." And then, for the first time, he broke. Tears streamed down his face as he recounted the details, the rage that consumed him when Jessica had rejected him, the impulsive violence, and the deliberate infiltration of Beaumont PD to monitor the investigation. He admitted to moving evidence, misdirecting detectives, and maintaining a facade of normalcy while he ensured the case remained cold. I wanted to be caught in a way, he confessed. Part of me wanted someone to find out. I couldn't live with it, but I couldn't stop myself either. Elena listened silently, the flood of emotions almost overwhelming. Anger, sorrow, relief. It all coalesced in a wave of exhaustion. Naomi observed quietly, documenting every detail, but she also understood the gravity of Elena's moment. This was closure decades in the making. After hours of interrogation, Cross was formally charged. Legal paperwork was finalized, arrest warrants confirmed, and prosecutors prepared for trial. News of his apprehension spread quickly, making headlines across Texas. The media focused on the decades-long cold case, the murderer who had infiltrated law enforcement, and the detectives whose persistence had finally brought justice. The next day, Elena called the Monroe family. Evelyn answered, her voice trembling. "Elena," she asked softly. "We found him," Elena said. "Daniel Cross, he's in custody. You'll finally have answers." There was a pause. Then Evelyn whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for never giving up." Harold and Rachel joined on the line, tears audible in their voices. For the first time in nearly 40 years, they felt a sense of relief, a possibility of peace. Elena listened, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders, though the echoes of grief and loss would remain forever. She hung up, staring out the window at Beaumont's skyline. The city had changed, but some things remained. The memory of a young woman whose life had been stolen, the pursuit of justice that transcended decades, and the knowledge that persistence could pierce through the darkness of deceit. Naomi entered, placing a hand gently on Elena's shoulder. "You did it," she said. "You saw it through." Elena smiled faintly, exhausted but resolute. "We did it," she corrected. "This was a team effort across generations. But for Jessica, I would have never stopped." As the sun set over Beaumont, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet, Elena felt a mixture of closure and reflection. 40 years of relentless pursuit had culminated in justice, and though the scars of the past would never fully heal, the future promised remembrance, accountability, and the affirmation that truth, no matter how long delayed, could not be denied. The courtroom in Beaumont buzzed with a tense energy that had nothing to do with the humid Texas weather pressing against the windows. It was September 2023, and the trial of Daniel Cross, once Daniel Whitaker, the man responsible for Jessica Monroe's murder, was finally underway. After nearly 4 decades, the community that had whispered about the unsolved case, the family that had carried grief like a second skin, and the investigators who had dedicated years to finding the truth had gathered for closure. Detective Elena Vargas sat in the front row, the weight of the years pressing down on her shoulders. She was 64 now, lines etched deep from stress, sleepless nights, and relentless pursuit of justice. Yet her posture was straight, alert, and resolute. Next to her sat the Monroe family, Evelyn and Harold Monroe holding hands tightly, and Rachel Monroe, who had grown into a poised, resilient woman. Their faces held the mixture of anticipation, sorrow, and a faint hope that justice might finally close a wound left open since 1985. The gallery was packed. Journalists with cameras, retired officers who had followed the case for decades, law students taking notes, and members of the public curious about the story that had haunted Beaumont for nearly 40 years. Daniel Cross was led in, still wearing the orange jumpsuit from his incarceration at the Connolly unit. His hair had thinned, and his once imposing frame seemed diminished with age, but his eyes, cold and calculating, still held that unmistakable flicker of the man who had orchestrated decades of deception. Judge Harold Sweeney called the court to order, his gavel banging against the wood with authority. "We are here to hear the case of the state versus Daniel Cross, charged with the first-degree murder of Jessica Monroe in August 1985. He paused, letting the weight of the years hang in the air. "Mr. Cross, how do you plead?" The room fell silent. Cross's voice, though roughened by age, carried through the courtroom with surprising clarity. "Guilty, Your Honor," he said. A ripple went through the room. Elena felt a lump in her throat. Years of unanswered questions, dead ends, and frustration had led to this moment. She remembered the night of Jessica's murder, the crime scene along the Neches River, the first time she had held Jessica's case file, and the feeling of helplessness that had haunted her for decades. It had all led here. The prosecutor, Catherine Mills, rose and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we request that the proceedings acknowledge the overwhelming evidence presented in this case. The DNA match, eyewitness testimonies, behavioral patterns of the defendant, and the documented history of his manipulation of the investigation while he served within Beaumont Police Department." She glanced at Elena and nodded subtly, acknowledging her decades-long dedication. Cross did not flinch. He had been confronted before, in interviews, interrogations, and even during the initial arrest, but this was different. This was public, permanent, and inescapable. He had evaded justice for so long, but now, in the same city where he had once worn a badge and manipulated evidence, the truth was finally undeniable. The courtroom proceedings moved methodically. The prosecutor detailed the events of August 14, 1985. Jessica Monroe, leaving her apartment to head to the bookstore for her part-time shift, the last interactions with friends, the discovery of her body along the secluded stretch of the Neches River. The defense remained silent, Cross listening, occasionally adjusting his cuffs. Elena listened carefully, her mind shifting between past and present. She could almost see Jessica walking along the path, hear her laughter echoing, feel the terror of that day. She had replayed that moment countless times in her mind, and now she was seeing it laid out in the courtroom, corroborated by evidence that technology had only recently allowed to surface. Family members were called to the stand. Evelyn Monroe's voice trembled as she recounted the days following Jessica's disappearance. The futile police searches, the evenings spent awake wondering what had happened. Harold Monroe, stoic but visibly strained, spoke of his growing doubt, his frustration, and finally, his acceptance of Elena's commitment to finding the truth. Rachel Monroe, who had been a young girl when her sister was murdered, described the long shadow Jessica's absence had cast over her life, the unanswered questions that shaped her childhood, and the slow, painful process of learning to live with grief. Each testimony painted a picture not just of loss, but of love, resilience, and the human cost of a crime that had gone unpunished for far too long. Cross's attorney eventually rose to speak. The words were carefully measured, legalistic, but there was no escaping the overwhelming evidence. They suggested the plea was in the interest of sparing the Monroe family additional trauma, of avoiding a prolonged trial, but the courtroom understood. The years of waiting, the frustration and the pain would not be mitigated by legal niceties. Elena's hands were folded tightly in her lap. She thought about the journey, the years as a rookie detective assigned to a case she could not forget, the promotions, the late nights sifting through evidence, the countless leads that had led to dead ends. She had worked alongside mentors like Lieutenant Robert Callahan, taken advice and guidance, and often defied it when intuition told her otherwise. Every choice had led her here. When it was finally her turn to provide testimony, Elena rose. Her voice was steady, her presence commanding yet tempered with the empathy she had always carried for victims. She recounted her initial investigation, the evidence collected, and the way the trail had gone cold despite her persistence. She described the subtle patterns she had observed, the inconsistencies in Cross's behavior, and the painstaking process of keeping Jessica's memory alive within the files and within her own heart. "You must understand," she said, looking directly at the jury. "Behind every case file is a real person, a life that mattered, a family that loved them. For 40 years, I carried the memory of Jessica Monroe with me. I never stopped believing that justice could be found, and today, finally, that belief has been validated." There was a collective hush in the courtroom. Even Cross did not meet her gaze. Elena returned to her seat, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over her. After several hours, Judge Sweeney pronounced the sentence. Daniel Cross, having entered a guilty plea, and in consideration of the evidence and the impact on the victim's family, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck again, sealing decades of pain into a legal resolution. The Monroe family wept openly. Evelyn and Harold embraced Rachel tightly. Elena stood back, allowing the family their moment, but she too felt a quiet tear escape. It was not only for Jessica, but for every sleepless night she had spent wondering if she had missed something, for every day she had carried the burden of a case unresolved. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Elena politely declined, but Rachel Monroe approached her. Gratitude etched in every line of her face. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for never giving up on her." Elena smiled, exhaustion and relief mingling. "I never could," she replied. "Jessica deserved justice. She deserved to be remembered." Weeks later, the Beaumont Police Department held a commendation ceremony. Elena, now fully retired, was honored for her decades-long dedication to justice. Lieutenant Callahan, no longer active but present for the ceremony, offered a quiet nod of approval. Detective Naomi Chen, who had played a pivotal role in revisiting the cold case, stood beside Elena, representing the new generation of investigators inspired by her work. "Detective Vargas," the chief said, addressing her directly, "your persistence, integrity, and unwavering commitment to the truth have set a standard that will guide this department for generations. Today, we recognize not just the results of your work, but the heart and dedication that made it possible." Elena accepted the commendation humbly, thinking not of accolades but of the young woman whose life had been stolen, whose story had finally been honored. Naomi Chen clasped her hand in solidarity, a silent acknowledgement of mentorship and the passing of the torch. In the months following the trial, Elena settled into her retirement in a quiet neighborhood in Beaumont. She spent mornings tending to a small garden she had cultivated over the years, afternoons reading journals and revisiting old case files for personal study, and evenings reflecting on the long journey she had endured. But every August, without fail, she made her way to the Neches River, to the spot near where Jessica Monroe's life had been taken, to leave flowers and speak quietly to the young woman who had changed her life. The Monroe family joined her each year, maintaining the ritual as a bridge between past grief and ongoing remembrance. Rachel, now an advocate for victims' rights, brought her own children, telling them stories about their aunt, ensuring that Jessica's legacy would endure. Evelyn and Harold, though older and quieter, found peace in the act of remembrance, their grief softened by the knowledge that justice had ultimately prevailed. Elena also began mentoring younger detectives, including Rachel Odom, now an ambitious investigator seeking to make her own mark on cold cases. Over coffee and case discussions, Elena imparted the wisdom accumulated over decades, the importance of persistence, empathy, and viewing victims as real people rather than mere case numbers. "Every cold case holds a story that deserves to be told," she reminded Rachel. "Sometimes it takes years, sometimes decades, but truth has a way of coming to light." In the spring of 2024, on Elena's 65th birthday, she sat in her garden watching new life flourish, tomatoes and peppers ripening under the Texas sun. She reflected on the years, the victories, the losses, the unsolved mysteries, and the ones finally resolved. Justice had been delayed in Jessica Monroe's case, but it had not been denied. And in that knowledge, Elena felt a quiet sense of closure, a peace that had eluded her for decades. Every year, she and the Monroe family continued the remembrance, a ritual that honored not only the victim, but the persistence, love, and dedication that had brought justice to light. And though Elena would no longer chase criminals through city streets or sift through evidence in dusty cold case files, her legacy endured. Through mentorship, guidance, and unwavering commitment to the truth, she had ensured that new generations of detectives would carry forward the lessons she had learned. That perseverance matters, that victims are never forgotten, and that justice, no matter how delayed, will ultimately prevail. As Elena placed white roses on Jessica Monroe's grave one final time that summer, she whispered softly, "Justice may be delayed, but truth never dies." The wind carried her words across the river, A promise kept, a life remembered, and a legacy secured. Thank you for joining us in uncovering stories hidden in the shadows. Every victim deserves to be remembered. Every truth deserves to be told. To follow more cold cases, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share these stories. Your support helps keep their voices alive.